Like we said, it's live. A little bit about the Bible background of the text we're going to hear. This season of Lent, we are following Jesus on the way to the cross. We heard the Reverend Jackie Lewis talk about relying on and resting on God in our tiredness. We heard the Reverend William Barber talk about becoming repairers of the breach. We heard the Reverend J.J. Crow talk about forgiving others and receiving God's forgiveness. She preached on 3 stories that Jesus told in Luke about the lost and the found. Now, in today's reading, we're 3 chapters on in Luke. Jesus is headed toward Jerusalem and his fate. He's talking to some who are very pleased about their own righteousness and looked down on and even despised other people. And of course, he tells a story of someone who, like them, was very upright and very self-satisfied, a religion teacher who went up to the temple to pray. Next to him, actually slumped in the shadows, was a reprobate, a tax collector. Everyone hated the tax collectors. He couldn't even hold up his head or look up. Spoiler alert, there's going to be a reversal at the end. And as for the reading from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, I am newly fascinated by the last part of the book of Isaiah, the part called 3rd Isaiah, written to encourage the people after they had returned home to Israel after the exile. It's a book about rebuilding. It's a book about repairing, restoring. And the conflict between those tasks inevitably comes up. It's also a book of encouragement, both in the rebuilding and in remaining steadfast in covenant with God. In today's reading, you can hear there's some concern about rebuilding the temple. And here's what God steps in and says about that. Essentially, what do I need a building for? Here's what I want from you all. I want humble and receptive spirits. JJ?
Our reading, excuse me, our reading from the book of Isaiah, chapter 66. God's message. Heaven's my throne, earth is my footstool. What sort of house could you build for me? What holiday spot reserved for me? I made all this. I own all this. God's decree. But there is something I'm looking for. A person humble and plain, reverently responsive to what I say. And a reading from the Gospel of Luke. He told his next story to some who were complacently pleased with themselves over their moral performance and looked down their noses at the common people. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a taxman. The Pharisee posed and prayed like this: "Oh God, I thank you that I am not like the other people, robbers, crooks, adulterers, or heaven forbid, like this taxman. I fast twice a week and tithe on all my income." Meanwhile, the taxman, slumped in the shadows, his face in his hands, not daring to look up, said, "God, give mercy, forgive me, a sinner." Jesus commented, "This taxman, not the other, went home made right with God. If you walk around with your nose in the air, you're going to end up flat on your face. But if you're content to be simply yourself, you will become more than yourself. You will become more than yourself."
Let's pray. Beloved God, may these words and may our meditations sink deeply into our souls, into our lives, and transform us and the world in which we live into something more holy. Amen. A Japanese Zen master named Non-in lived around the end of the 19th century, and during his days as a teacher, he was visited one time by a university professor who had been studying Zen and was curious to learn more. The professor had a lot to say about his studies and what he'd been learning. Being a polite man, Nanin served the professor a cup of tea, and he listened. As he poured, the professor's cup became full, but Nanin kept pouring and pouring. The tea reached the brim. It overflowed. It filled the saucer. It overflowed onto the floor. And the professor couldn't contain himself as Nanin kept pouring. "What are you doing? What are you doing? The cup is full. No more will go in." Nanin turned to the professor and said, "Well, like the cup, you too are full of your own opinions and your own self. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" Similarly, have you wondered why the cover of the bulletin today is a picture of a cross amid autumn leaves and soil? Shouldn't this be a picture of daffodils or something springy in the middle of March? Well, it was the best picture I could find of humus. Humus, from the Latin word for earth or soil, closely related to the Latin word humilis, meaning low, humble. Humus is the dark, crumbly organic matter that forms in soil when leaves and other plant and animal matter break down, decompose. The loose, open texture of humus helps absorb and retain water, and it's home to life-giving nutrients, especially nitrogen. Not for nothing do humus and humility share word origins. A heart that is porous, open, spacious, can receive the Spirit of God in prayer. A cup that is empty can receive wisdom. But a heart that is consumed with its own goodness, with comparing itself to others, to other people we might think are lesser beings, that heart is hardened off. It's hard soil. It's a full cup. Nothing good or useful can get into it. No wonder God says to the returning Israelites, "It's not so much a temple that I want. What kind of house could you build for me? What I want is a person who is humble. What I want is a person who is reverently responsive to what I say." An empty cup, soft and absorbent humus, humility. Now, by humility, I don't mean self-abasement, but I think we're talking about not being filled with ourselves either. C.S. Lewis once said, "Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking less often about yourself." It seems like the modern human condition to me, to be filled with ourselves, to be blindly arrogant. One of my favorite Kurt Vonnegut books is narrated by a ghost, 10 million years in the future. And in that future, humans have evolved, they've returned to the water, and we have otter-like pelts, and we've lost our opposable thumbs. Oh, and our brains have shrunk to about a third what they were at their peak. So as the ghost, who has lived a long, long time, all these years, narrates the absurdities of life back in the day, back in our time, he repeatedly tells of some ridiculous disaster over and over. And he'll say, "Oh, I forgot. That's when humans had opposable thumbs and those big brains that got them in so much trouble." We love our analytical big brains, don't we? We're prized for them. And they have brought us a long, long, long way, and God knows we couldn't be doing what we're doing technically in worship without them. But we're also constantly tripping over them, aren't we? Time after time, I see people who refuse help, who refuse to see counselors, for instance, or might refuse to listen to the ones they have because they have decided they're too smart to be helped by these lesser mortals. When I worked more closely with youth back in the day, I'd see it over and over again. I'd see these youth lauded for being so smart, and they were smart. are smart, they would bring to youth group and confirmation very full teacups. It broke my heart. It broke my heart, and it reminded me of me at that age. I think we would do them and ourselves a great service if we helped each other understand maybe three things. First, there is a difference between being smart and wise, isn't there? Smart is a matter of being quick-witted, possessing analytical intelligence. Wisdom is that plus experience, knowledge, judgment. A smart person, as I've said many times, a smart person knows that a tomato is a fruit, and will probably tell you that. A wise person knows still, you don't put it in a fruit salad. Have you ever heard anybody say, oh, he's too wise for his own good? I don't think I've ever heard that. Now, I didn't personally count them one by one, but one source says that the word wisdom is mentioned 219 times in the Bible, and the word intelligent, maybe 9. Solomon didn't ask God for more smarts. Solomon asked God for more wisdom. Too bad he didn't get it. Anyway, I think we would also do our children and ourselves and our society a great service if we emphasize that there are many kinds of intelligence. There's, to name a few, logical intelligence, linguistic, spatial, musical, body kinesthetic, interpersonal, and naturalistic intelligence. A lot of kinds of intelligences that are not measured well on a standard IQ test. And I think we also do our children and ourselves well when we expose ourselves to the humble regularity of spiritual practices and worship, as well as to the novelty of new peoples, new situations, the vastness of nature, whether a work trip to Standing Rock or a night in a desert gobsmacked by the vastness of the night sky. Experiences which revitalize us and relativize us and bring us new perspective and humility. The opposite of all of that is hubris, or excessive pride. The Pharisee in the temple, he posed and prayed and said, "Thank God I'm not like those other people. Look how good I am. What a bunch of losers they are." It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But you know what else it sounds like? It sounds like our country for the last 4 years. Actually, I'd say it sounds like our country for the last 40 years. American exceptionalism says that we are simply better than any other country in the world by any measure. We're smarter, we're wealthier, we're better organized, better defended. Well, humility really had a go at us this last year, didn't it? Remember last February? From the White House we heard, it's going to be fine. We're testing everyone we need to test, and we're finding very little problem. The 15 cases of COVID in the United States within a couple days is going to be down to close to 0. And here, I thought I was so smart here. Well, we'll probably be worshiping online through Easter, I sagely said. Well, we did do that. I'm glad I had no idea that we would be worshiping online another year plus. How could I have not known? How could I have not known? The pandemic humbled us all. No, the pandemic slammed us to the ground in a big cloud of humble dust. And if that wasn't enough, whoever was handing out humblings, we had the reckoning of long, festering racial wounds in about time. And if that wasn't enough, the climate change bill started coming due with fires. Oh, remember the fires. Remember that one day where fires were springing up all over the state, it seemed. But humility wasn't through with us. there was still an election and an insurrection to get through, and then just for extra measure, an ice storm. And for a few in the congregation, significant and long-lasting power outages. Are we humble yet? Chief Justice John Roberts told graduating seniors at his son's high school, online of course, that the coronavirus has pierced our illusion of certainty and control. And he counseled the students to make their way forward with humility, compassion, and courage in a world turned upside down. It is a world turned upside down in many ways. Now, what none of these have told us is how to cultivate humility. God has no tips for Isaiah that I know of, neither is Jesus offering a how-to in his story about the two men in the temple. But I have been reading some things actually in business magazines about how leaders can cultivate their own humility in this challenging time, and I don't know why it won't work for us all, leaders and followers and those in the vast middle. First of all, manage the ego. Manage the ego. And you can do that by seeking out other opinions. Ask questions. Question certainties, especially your own. Encourage dialogue. Share responsibility. Manage the ego. Manage the mind. Keep an open mind. Stay curious. Seek coaching and counseling. Keep learning. Manage the mind. And the third is manage the emotion. Empathy is proving to be critical in getting through this crisis. Empathetic leaders are doing the best job in leading their countries, we've seen. Empathy enhances our shared sense of solidarity and grit and helps build a community of caring that will last far beyond these difficult times. Empathy, manage the emotion. Manage the ego, manage the mind, manage the emotion, cultivate humility. And remember C.S. Lewis's saying, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. We have been humbled this past year, and that is not a bad thing. With our new humility comes wisdom to recognize what is most central in our lives. And I hear it over and over and over again as I ask you all, what's turned out to be most central in your life this year? What do you miss most? The answer is family, friends, hugs, connection, spirit, community. It has turned out that one of the things that is most central in our lives is this: worship, church community, again, connection. With our new humility comes not only that understanding of what's most central in our lives, but eyes wide open to the disparities in our country that have been there a long time. Eyes wide open to what and who turns out to be essential. And with our new humility comes commitment to rebuilding, to repairing the breach, to creating a more livable and sustainable world for all God's people and creatures. What does God need? That sounds like a big job. It sounds like we're going to need a lot of blueprints and roadmaps. But then God told those rebuilding Israelites, be humble and plain. Be responsively reverent and reverently responsive to what I say. And we will, with God's guidance, listening to one another, we will go forward together. We will. And it's coming. I'm glad to have been on the journey with you all so far, and glad to be going forward together on the next steps. Amen.